Today we're talking about Eleanor of Aquitaine as Duchess and Queen of France, the very first of her major life roles. The 13-year-old Eleanor became a great heiress in her own right upon the death of her father. King Louis, on the other hand, Louis of France, who lived from 1077 to 1137, moved very swiftly to secure her marriage to his son and heir, the 17-year-old Louis, who had been crowned in 1131 at Reims in late July of 1137. He sent his highest royal advisor, Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, to Bordeaux in order to make sure the marriage happened. And he made sure that the ceremony and the oaths emphasized the subordination of Eleanor's Aquitaine to his France. And we want to remember there that the Aquitaine, as we talked about in the last lecture, was entirely separate from France. Although they acknowledged the French king as their overlord, the lands themselves were separate. They were not at that point considered a piece of France. Only days after the marriage of Eleanor and Louis, King Louis, Louis VI, unexpectedly died, a hazard of medieval kings and modern people, and another ceremony was held at Poitiers that now confirmed Eleanor and Louis as Louis VII and his queen. Louis VII, of course, lived from 1120 to 1180 and reigned, therefore, from 1137 to 1180. And they were now the new king and queen of France. They were married for almost 15 years. How is it that his reign and her life and his outlasted their marriage by such a long time? Chroniclers who commented on their marriage said that Louis loved Eleanor passionately, but it was later rumored that she resented him. Marriage to some seemed politically and personally troubled from its very earliest days. Eleanor, it is now thought, thanks to the work of Professor Andrew Lewis, who is publishing these findings in a book I've just co-edited called Eleanor of Aquitaine, Lord and Lady, has demonstrated that Eleanor was born in 1124 and not 1122, as historians previously assumed. She was therefore a mere 13 when she inherited the Aquitaine. Eleanor's background, which we went into in the last lecture in more length, is worth rehearsing here. The few facts of her known childhood provide a perspective for understanding her interests and her aims as an adult. She was the first daughter and the second child of William X of Aquitaine and his first wife, Anor, or Anor, of Chantereau. The form of her name, Ali Anor, shows that she was named after her mother as another Anor, Alia Nor. She was the granddaughter, as we know, of William IX of Aquitaine, that mocking and cynical duke and poet and crusader, who was also, as we talked last time, a womanizer to an extraordinary degree, and at least one of his wives took refuge from him in the house of Fontevraud, the great monastic house where abbesses directed the community of men and of women assembled there to serve God. After this, William had a notorious affair with the Viscountess of Chantereau, whose daughter he then married to his own son. William IX's exploits with writing and about women gained him considerable renown in his own time and for a time ever since. One of the 14th century Vedas, one of the troubadours' lives, call him one of the world's great courtiers and beguilers of women. He traveled far and wide in order to deceive them. In one poem he wrote about a distant love, one from who was adored but never seen, with whom he could easily dispense because of the nicer, prettier, and worthy girls next door. William's writing suggests that he thought women should be on a pedestal, perhaps, or in a bed, but never in the court or in the chamber council. He may actually have established at Niort, one of his own castles, the abbey of courtesans that was modeled on Fontevraud, about which he wrote. In short, while he seemed to have loved women and seemed to have been at least religious in his behavior, he seemed to have little respect for either women or for the church. As a small child, Eleanor must have known her grandfather, this larger-than-life character by any age's standards, though he died when she was very young. She may not have remembered him personally, but surely she heard people talk about him and his exploits. And she and her parents and her elder brother William were under his authority at the beginning of her life. William IX, who was Eleanor's father, William X, Eleanor's father, was less flamboyant than his own father, and he was known chiefly, as we said last time, for his enormous physical appetites. As this suggests, he was no ascetic. He had 2 bastard sons, and after the death of his first wife in 1130, he married again. Nonetheless, he, unlike his father, was remembered not for his pursuit of women, but rather as a contentious and then faithful son of the church, cowed and humbled by Bernard of Clairvaux. And we remember that story of him in 1125, and then on Good Friday, having gone on pilgrimage in 1137 to Santiago de Compostela. On Good Friday, the 9th of April, 1137, he died on his way to Santiago and was buried under the church's main altar, thus bringing together some of the major sites we identify with both religious activity and pilgrimage, and the way in which we think of pilgrimage as both submission to the church and some kind of recompense for one's own sins. There we have William himself embodying that with his burial under the altar in Santiago at the very edge of Spain. Eleanor and her sister Alice Petronella as she was known, were left orphans and alone with the death of their father, for their elder brother had died in the same year as had their mother, that is in 1130. Before he departed for Spain for Santiago, however, their father had provided his daughters and their lands with a powerful guardian in his overlord, Louis VI, King of France. Now, Louis VI shrewdly decided that his son, his namesake, and his heir, whom, as I said before, had been crowned at Reims, the typical crowning place of the French kings, that he's the one who should marry Eleanor. From that decision flowed the long problem and chains of events that led inexorably to the subordination of Aquitaine to France, and then the subordination of Aquitaine to England, and finally to the long wars of the 14th and 15th centuries that resulted in 1453 in the fall of Bordeaux and the territory's definitive and final incorporation into the Kingdom of France. That is, the union between the Aquitaine and France, which Louis had so envisioned for his son and their heirs, did not come to pass until centuries later in 1453, at the end of that great conflict we'll be talking about as the 100 Years' War when we discuss the life of Joan of Arc. It was Joan who precipitated the final set of events that brought France together in one nation as we now know it. In the short run, however, the alignment of Aquitaine and France was very advantageous to both Eleanor and to Louis. As historian Peggy Brown puts it, the marriage brought to Eleanor, who was then just 13, assurances of support against the restless lords of Aquitaine, and Louis gained authority in a rich region that had been exempt from French control, and he also gained the prospect, the hope, what turned out, of course, to be the forlorn hope, of the territory's eventual incorporation into the realm of France. What is it that Eleanor got, in other words? Protection from any unruly underlords who might come looking for her or for her territory. What is it that Louis got? Eleanor and all that territory, in the hope that it would all be put together in one froth later called France. Eleanor had already been committed to the guardianship of her overlord, King Louis, when her father died. What is really important about this father's death is that we know that her father explicitly allocated the Aquitaine for her and for her heirs as a separate property, not to be annexed into one territory with France just upon the marriage of Eleanor and Louis. Wills, as we know, are not always followed by those who are the heirs and have different ideas. But in this case, the will of William X was matched by the willfulness of his daughter and his underlords. The Aquitaine remained Eleanor's. We know nothing with certainty of Eleanor's youth, but we can presume it to have been led in a very colorful court in the south of France, full of visitors from many cultures, abundant with elegant varieties of food and clothing, sounding with music and an amusing speech, given the character of her family, of her grandfather, of the visitors we know passed through their court, particularly at Poitiers. But when he died, leaving Eleanor an orphan, young Louis left his own father ill in Paris, and he, then only 17 years old, proceeded southward with Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis and a host of others they called heroes. In late July, he and Eleanor were married in Bordeaux. With him, she was crowned in a ceremony in which a brand new coronation order emphasized the subordination of Aquitaine as well as Burgundy to the King of France. So they wrote a whole new method of coronation in order to make sure that Eleanor, as the crown of Queen of France was put on her head, knew that her land and she were now subject to the authority of her king, now husband. On the 1st of August, Louis VI died, and the news of his death was rapidly transmitted to the south. On August 8th, another ceremony was held in Poitiers, the middle of Eleanor country, where a second coronation rite was performed. Orderic Vitalis, the chronicler, reports that by this coronation, Louis obtained the kingdom of the Franks and the duchy of Aquitaine, which none of his ancestors had held. Alas, Orderic was wrong in that he did not obtain it, he merely had its use while he was married to Eleanor. But the ritual may have been regarded as a reaffirmation of all those earlier rituals in which first Louis was crowned at Reims as the heir to the throne, and then at Bordeaux when he was married and crowned again, and then finally as the sole king of France. What we have here, in other words, is something quite different from our presumption in modern terms that one is crowned only once, that a king receives one coronation. What we have throughout France and in many of these French families are many different coronations that take place over the long and extended youths of these young men, until sometimes they receive a final coronation after their fathers have died. But fathers will split property and crown their sons to be dukes and their underlords in certain regions. Just as now we are familiar with the notion in England, for instance, of having not only a king or queen, but also a Prince of Wales who was crowned as the heir to the throne. All of these kinds of organizations and ways of thinking about lordship were very much in flux in Eleanor's own time. And we want to be aware of how important, therefore, the Aquitaine was to Louis as a means of solidifying his power, of solidifying a kind of royal power, because it would be bringing such wealth into the Kingdom of France. Eleanor brought Louis the sweeping lands he now ruled as Duke, and that status prompted him to begin using not just all of the seals he had had before this time, but an impressive equestrian counter seal in which it was marked that he was King of France and Duke of the Aquitaine. Largely owing to his marriage to Eleanor, Louis had as king the prospect of exercising far more authority and enjoying far greater wealth than his father ever had. And promoting then and defending his wife's interests, he claimed, Louis led expeditions against Poitiers and especially against Toulouse. This marriage was then a great coup for the Capetian French dynasty. Was it for Eleanor? Marriage re-emphasized her status as a lady rather than an independent lord. That is, in the medieval scheme of power relationships, she was relegated to the position of lady in relation to her lordly husband. But Eleanor remained active as queen and duchess of the Aquitaine along with Louis, though he did not prove very successful with her people. What can you imagine it was like for Eleanor to have moved to the north, to leave her sun-dappled homelands for the harsh, cold climate of Paris? Again, we have very few records upon which we can make judgments. We don't know the size of her retinue. We don't know the state of her apartments in Paris. We don't know the names or the habits of those who accompanied her. It is that information for which historians now search. Did the marriage appeal to Eleanor? We don't know anything about her original response to Louis. Did she love Louis in those early days? She was barely beyond childhood, merely 13, and the chroniclers do not record her early responses to the new king. It was said later that she found him monk-like. We remember that Louis was himself raised at the Abbey of Saint-Denis. He, however, was reputed to have adored her. John of Salisbury said in 1149 that he vehemently loved the queen in a boyish way, whatever that means. Was the question of love even relevant? For this society, probably not. It would be a nice addition, a special kind of gift to a necessary relation. Surely she was practical enough to understand the marriage norms of her time, which assumed that for people of property, marriage must be based on property concerns. But by all reports, Louis VII doted on Eleanor. For her, it's possible that the next several years were quite unhappy. She hated the eunuch Thierry Galleran, who was an advisor whom Louis inherited from his father. The mockery that she visited on Thierry may have been prompted not only by resentment at his influence over Louis, but also at frustration over what became increasingly called her own barrenness, her incapacity to bear a child. If we can't judge much about her affection for Louis, we can see his failures to pursue successful ducal policies on her behalf. Louis failed in his attempts to secure Eleanor's claim to Toulouse. Now, Eleanor's claim was through her grandmother Philippa, whose father was Count William of Toulouse and Emma of Mortain. So those grandparents who held Toulouse were ones through whom she asserted her claim. Louis also failed to secure a fast, peaceful resolution in war with Champagne, which was provoked by Eleanor's sister's scandalous marriage to a man who deserted his wife, the sister of Theobald, Count of Champagne. That is, Petronilla, Eleanor's sister, married King Louis's seneschal, Count Raoul of Vermandois, although Raoul had an existing union with a noblewoman of the House of Champagne. These were all very important families we're talking about who didn't like their daughters dismissed out of hand when someone more attractive came along. This brought the church's wrath upon both that couple and upon Louis and Eleanor. This marriage led to Louis's involvement in a tragic war with Champagne that culminated in an awful Holocaust at Vitry. I want us to try to understand that set of events. Eleanor's sister Petronilla, who was evidently given to expressing some of the outrageously candid legacy of the House of Aquitaine, had fallen in love with a randy and ambitious cousin of the king, the seneschal, Raoul of Vermandois. There were several reasons why Petronilla and Raoul were an inappropriate pair. She was 16. He was in his early 50s. But age gaps that extreme were not entirely unusual among the medieval nobility in their marriages. But the fact that Petronilla had fallen in love with Raoul and may have initiated their adulterous affair no doubt raised many eyebrows. Raoul was, in addition, married. Worse, Raoul's wife was the daughter of the neighboring family of Champagne and Blois, possibly the French crown's richest and most powerful vassals, who ruled territories east, south, and west of the Capetian family's Paris-based royal domains. They were always giving their Capetian overlords some kind of trouble about contested feudal rights. Alienating them any further, and with an insult to the family honor in the family house, was a very bad idea. Eleanor didn't seem to care, or she didn't care enough in any case, to rein in her sister. Were her sister the sort of person who might have been reined in? Somehow one suspects with Eleanor, with Petronilla, and with their father and grandfather, there might have been a gene in the family that said, "Don't rope me in." Eleanor backed a faction at the court that arranged a dubious annulment for Raoul. That is, you can't get divorced, but you can get annulled. You can suddenly decide and find out that you are too closely related in marriage to your marital partner. You can therefore have the marriage dissolved if you find clergy willing to do so, and for each person it's as if they have never been married before. Well, Eleanor backed the faction that arranged a dubious annulment for Raoul and got some very pliable members of the clergy to marry Raoul and Petronilla, who thus became the Count and Countess of Vermandois, an area north of Paris. Leaders of church reform who didn't like the way all these annulments were being used, people like Bernard of Clairvaux, were outraged by what they saw as a cynical, corrupt violation of canon law. The mighty family of Raoul's discarded wife were outraged, those of Champagne and Blois, and they went to war to avenge her and their family honor. At one point in a skirmish in the forest of Brie, we think of the cheese, of Brie that lay between Champagne and the Capetian royal domain, a skirmish took place that led to an attack on a peasant village called Vitry. The peasants fled into their church for asylum, but somehow the church caught fire, and the fire spread very quickly. King Louis arrived on the scene just in time to hear the screams of his humble subjects being incinerated in their own violated church. Any medieval Christian ruler would have been likely to feel distress at that moment and at this turn of events. But Louis, who had been brought up in the cloister of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, seems to have been rendered inconsolate by it. And he knew that having backed Petronilla, he had sinned, and that he had sinned badly. Louis went into a serious depression. In 1142, at the same time, Louis's forces in Champagne had committed terrible and unspeakable atrocities, including the torching of this village. This failure to achieve his goals in war, as well as his personal guilt, seems to have broken Louis's martial spirit. Not long before this, in 1141, to go back to Eloise and stories we've considered so far, the Council of Sens found Abelard guilty of heresy, and they doomed him to perpetual silence. And they furthermore excommunicated him. France was at this point, at this time, a hotbed of spiritual and civil unrest, full of clerical and civil disputes. And the Council of Sens, as we've already seen, may have been engineered by Abbot Suger or others who wanted to impose new structures of authority against both the kind of interiorized theory of intentionalism, theology of intentionalism, for which Abelard stood, and as well Bernard's theory of interior spirituality. Each of those kinds of theology, although they clashed with each other, represented a notion of high individuality, a certain kind of radical individualism in human rights. More practical minds than theirs were concerned with some immediate threats presented by radical individualism, especially from the many new communes that were springing up in France and Italy especially. These communes represented chaos against the civil order, and they therefore were movements to try to require submission to authority and thus achieve social cohesion. So to put Abelard in his place was simply to make a move that was going to generate a great deal of insistence that the civil authority would take power over clerical authority in order to assert and maintain the public order. And furthermore, there was an attempt doing this to centralize the powers of government having to do both with the ecclesiastical orders and with the civil orders, to try to centralize the power of the Church of France under the control of Suger or the bishops closer to Paris, with the power of the king over the communes and all of his underlords. Although Bernard of Clairvaux tried to resolve the dispute about Petronilla, Eleanor's sister and her husband, Count Raoul, and to force Louis' submission, It was only by 1144, when all France came to see the new Gothic wonder of Abbot Suger's new Chevet at Saint-Denis, that Louis made firm peace with the church and with the counts of Champagne. The kind of severe repression which took place after Vitry was seen then, as it sometimes is now, as a force and guarantee of social cohesion. But they could celebrate this moment of social cohesion by celebrating something new and beautiful in the world, looking at that place where we see Gothic architecture itself invented, the Abbey of Saint-Denis and its east and its west ends. This was the moment, the dedication of this new Chevet, which gave us the conclusion of a peace treaty among the king, the church, and the Count of Champagne. Peace was finally made. It may have been at that very moment that King Louis gave Abbot Suger a magnificently decorated rock crystal vase that is still extant. And Louis gave Suger this vase for the use of Saint-Denis. The inscription on the vase's base, composed by Suger, very proudly states that this vase, Aenor, gave as a bride to King Louis, Miraculous to her grandfather, the king to me, and Suger to the saints. It was an exotic and sentimental gift that came into Eleanor's family through an Arab king, the Emir of Saragossa, and it testifies to the wild and wide cultural dimension that Eleanor added to the kingdom of France. This was not an object, in other words, that represented simply a continuity of line of one place, but rather suggested the openness to many cultures that the family of Eleanor had come to mean in the Western experience. Not simply an understanding of the southern French world of Occitania, but also a world that was permeable to the influences of Hispania and of the Arab world, of the Muslim world. It was not an unsophisticated world that lived inside either one language or one small territory of land. At this point, at this very meeting in Saint-Denis in 1144, Bernard of Clairvaux himself began to influence Eleanor. He came to meet her. He talked to her. He gave her counsel. And he made her promise that she would agree with him that if she worked for peace, he would make sure that she was able to have the reward of a child. The reward of a child is what she had not yet achieved. And it was having that child that was going to give her her real measure of power now in France. Duchess of the Aquitaine and Queen of France she would be. But until she became mother of the heir, she would always have an only partial power to produce into the future. Exactly a year later, in 1145, Eleanor's first child, her daughter Marie, was born, just as Bernard had said she would be. Was that birth enough to bring contentment and calm to the young couple? Was motherhood itself enough to satisfy Eleanor and Louis? The difference between Eleanor in her early lifetime and the world of the Aquitaine can be seen as clearly in this moment as in any other facts of their lives. Eleanor was the heiress to the Aquitaine because in Aquitania, women could, until that moment, be the great heiresses who were lord of their land. Eleanor was lord of her people. Her daughter, however, having been born in France as the daughter of the King of France, could only ever be called princess. She would have to marry a king to become a queen. She herself would not hold those rights. The Capetian line was a male line, and power passed from male to male. For Eleanor, was it better to be Queen of France by virtue of marriage than Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right? Not until Elizabeth I of England, several centuries later, would another European woman face the question of marriage with so much her own freedom, position of her child, her own sense of achievement, with so much riding on the line.